Thank you very much for joining us today as we begin this very important workshop on writing the facts. My name is Dr. Thompson Fontaine. I'm the author of the book, The Maroons of Dominica, 1764 to 1818, Resistance, Rebellion, and Freedom from Slavery. It's a historical account of the Negma of Dominica, and I'll be facilitating this session, which is a production of Write-Tukubuli, as we attempt to promote the arts and literary excellence in Dominica. So I'm very pleased to be a part of this, and I've prepared a short presentation that I'll go through. And for those of you who are joining me and who want to interact, feel free to do so as well as we go through. But the whole idea is to try to point to some of the key elements, the key things that goes into writing nonfiction. It's a very different approach than if you're doing fiction, where basically if a work of fiction is up to your imagination and that's it. You can imagine as far and as wide and as broadly as you wish. But with the writing of nonfiction, and in particular historical pieces, there is a lot of attention that must be paid to detail for issues like accuracy, because you have to record as much as possible. It has to be factual, and so we'll delve into all of those various issues. So I'm going to begin by presenting by sharing a small presentation, which we will kind of go through, that highlights some of the things that I wish to speak about today. So if you just bear with me as I open this presentation. Okay, it appears to be uploading. So it's a very interesting discussion, of course, for those for the budding writers and those who really wants to get into the art of writing. I think there is a lot to be learned, a lot to be exchanged, but there is a particular process involved, and we certainly want to pay attention to that process to ensure not only your quality work, but to ensure that whatever you produce is not questioned. So the issues of legality, copyright, plagiarism, all of those will be discussed as well in the context of this. Okay, so we're going to be looking at this, the essential guidelines to creating compelling and accurate content. All right, so that's what we will be discussing. And we want to look at the outline that we'll be utilizing today in this workshop as we discuss non-fiction writing. We will begin by outlining so that all of us understand what we mean when we say non-fiction or writing about the facts, the different genres and the purpose. Then we'll talk about what goes into any non-fiction work, the research and the fact-checking process. And then there'll be a discussion on structuring and organizing non-fiction content. Then we'll also talk about writing styles and the different considerations and responsibilities that must go, both legal and copyright issues that must be considered. So that's how we'll proceed with this, and that's the way we're going to be looking at it today as we move along. So let's move then to understanding the various nonfiction genres and their purpose. So we're going to begin with an overview of the various genres of nonfiction, and that will involve issues of being clear, for example, on the target audience, and as far as possible, clarifying the purpose and the message. All right, let's talk about the non-fiction genres. There are two broad genres. We have diverse non-fiction. So we're talking about biographies, where you talk about the the story of an individual. You have to record the life story of an individual, or an autobiography when it is done by someone else. Then you have essays, a key part of that. Self-help books that just mean to give information. Then there is history, and there is journalism, and there are also different books. For example, you might have a book on leadership styles, the styles of leadership, dietary books, and all of those that basically that would fall into this non-fiction. So each an important convention to note is that there are specific conventions that has to be observed, and expectations for each of this content. So, for example, if you're doing a historical piece, the focus is a little bit different than if you're writing an autobiography, or if you're simply writing an essay to explain a concept or to bring information forward to the public. Right. So let's look about the target audience and how we define this. We are talking about understanding the specific needs of our audience, and that is very important because that ensures the relevant content delivery being tailored to those individuals. And then recognizing audience interests helps in crafting, engaging, and appealing messages that capture attention effectively. And for that, I would like to give a very good example of this. A few years ago, because in addition to the book that I wrote, I'm also the editor of the Dominican.net, and I've written a number of articles, research articles in the Dominican.net, human interest stories, but also going way back to my school days, I was also the editor of a school newspaper. So I've been writing for a very, very long time. So when I came to write in the Maroons of Dominica, it was an interesting prospect. But I wanted to talk a little bit about a particular essay that I wrote a few years ago in the Dominican.net. And it had to do with a very interesting aspect of Dominican life. And it was a story that was told to me by a police officer, and that happened in the late 70s, and that was the time when Dominica, you had the Dread Act had just been passed, and you had the police officers who were in search of the Rastafarians in the hills of Dominica, and he related to me a story that I found to be of really keen interest, that I took a keen interest in, and that story had to do with the actual search. They were conducting a search, and then they came across a hut in the middle of the forest. It was Easter Saturday. It was an Easter Saturday, and they surrounded the house, the police officers, and they called for the people inside to come out. There was one individual who eventually came out, but when he came out, they were surprised to see that he was dressed all in black suit. He had a black suit on. And they kept calling on him to put his hand in the air, to raise his hand to ensure that he had no weapon or anything. He refused to do so. So one of the police officers, kind of rushed him and put his arms up, and 2 eggs actually dropped from under his arms, like eggs. And it was very interesting to me because growing up as a young child, there were those stories that have been circulated that talked about persons in the community who got rich. They would go through a ritual around Easter time where they would create what we call a mousse. And the way that was supposed to have been done is that they would put, just as this gentleman was doing, they would put these chicken eggs under their arms, and it was supposed to hatch a small creature, and that creature would give them untold wealth. And they would have to basically pay allegiance to this individual, to this what we call a mousse, for the rest of their life. So I found it to be interesting. I decided to write about it, but in writing about it, I thought it had some very important connotations. So I took the liberty of actually going through the various aspects of the story, to include some of those. And one of the things that I did was to take some time in writing this, but it was really a non-fiction piece, but in actually trying to describe the environment around this. And I want to read just a little part of it, and because there is a story to this that I want to close with, but I thought it would be interesting to relay that, to give a very good idea as to what it means to make your delivery as interesting as possible. So I'm going to just read three paragraphs, the first three paragraphs of this particular nonfiction piece. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because a few days after publishing this particular story on the net, I received a call from one of the top professors in the United States, who was actually teaching journalists and writers how to write. And she was calling me for permission to use this particular essay for her students, because she thought that it really captured the essence of writing, and would be a good example of what to do, of what to write. So let me just read what I think made it, because although the story was about this individual believing in this myth, who was doing this, but being able to capture some more of the elements around it. So it starts by saying that no one is quite sure how the stories are started, how believable they are, and even why they persist to this day. You be the judge. It is the height of the dread crisis in the country. This is a period of social unrest and political intrigue. Police patrols unrelentingly search for illicit marijuana plantations and chase down the hundreds of Rastafarians who choose to make their home in the so-called Zion, that is the lush, mountainous, and expansive regions of the island. On this Easter Saturday in Dominica, there is nary a cloud in the sky. In gentle sea breezes kiss the verdant coastline, and the towering mountains stand as they always have, as though jealously guarding this beautiful country. From these mountains, hundreds of rivers rush eagerly toward the sea. Nature is alive and on visible display in Dominica. In the many scattered villages around the country, it is business as usual. Children fetch water, swim in the crystal clear waters, fish, throw stones at birds, and set animal traps. Grown-ups attending their gardens, plucking weeds, spreading fertilizer, while others harvest the endless variety of fruit and vegetables. Cocoa and coffee buds are laid out to dry. Green straw is spread out on hot asphalt streets to be used later for making doormats. Smoke rises lazily from dozens of fireplaces as meals are being prepared on open fires. This is the kind of day for which you are thankful for being born in a country with such natural abundance. In times like these, most of us can even forget that we don't have lots of money to spend. That is most, not all. In the frantic search for escape, even from a life so simple and beautiful, some among us go beyond what we see, feel, and touch. Dreams are made and just as easily crushed, yet we hope, we imagine, we dare to believe the unbelievable. And so that is just the prelude to going on now to explaining the particular story and the whole idea around this aspect. So I wanted to make a reference to this for a few reasons. One, because it was selected to play that role, but I think more importantly, it lends to what we're talking about, creating that interest, because there was a non-Dominican person reading this piece online and who felt that it was good enough to be exposed to an audience that knew nothing of Dominica, but because of the way it was written, because of the style in which it was written. So that's very important. So when considering writing nonfiction, the tone that is used, the mode of delivery becomes very important. And if you can create around the main theme, if you can create an interest, but still being able to link that interest to what is being spoken about, it will make your book or your essay a lot more enjoyable and open you up to a lot more readers. And also, it might be obvious, but it's important that when writing, that you direct it to the audience, that you know the age of the audience. So if you're writing a children's book, for example, you have to be aware of the age group that has been focused on, and the kind of language that is used, the words that are used, and so on, has to certainly conform to that particular age group. All right, that is very important. If you're writing a book, like for example, a history book, then you'd probably be targeting a certain group of individuals who probably have an interest in history, or probably a school class or something. So you also bear that in mind. All right. So that is the whole idea of knowing your audience, and then the issue of clarifying the purpose and message. That is very, very important. Before you figure out exactly how you want to put down what you want to write, you have to define a very clear purpose. Okay, so for example, when I wrote the book, it's a historical account. For me, the purpose of writing this book was I grew up in a small village in Dominica called Grand Fond, which is just 2 miles from a major estate, the Rosalie estate. So most of our great-grandparents and so on, they were actually slaves on that estate. And we grew up hearing a story about a major slave rebellion on that particular estate. But I could not find information. I knew about it. I knew vaguely about the name of the Maroon leader who had led that revolt. I understood that he was from my area, but never actually getting the information. So for me, the purpose of writing about this was an attempt to capture what I thought was a critical aspect of Dominican life and the history of Dominica, but yet it was not written, it was not there. So that was my purpose for doing it. So similarly, as you craft or you do nonfiction, you want to think of what it is that you want, right? Is it a personal interest? Is it something that you want to clarify? So for example, someone might have gone through an experience, say, with defeating cancer, and they may want to be able to spread that information to persons who may be going through a similar thing. So that becomes your purpose. The purpose of writing is that you've gone through a particular experience and you want to share that experience with as many people as possible. So that's the idea of having this very clear purpose for writing. And having established that purpose, you want to be consistent and you want to ensure that you stay on message. So although once I defined my purpose was to write, I then said, okay, let's write about the Maroons of Dominica. These individuals who dominated headlines, who dominated the country's landscape between 1763 and 1818, about 15 years before the abolition of slavery. But they were dominant figures in the historical life of the country, and so wanted to write. So every chapter of that book revolves around that theme of the Negmawa, because that is what the focus is on. So you want to always ensure that whatever theme is selected revolves very strongly around what was the original purpose. So in other words, you don't want to go into many different directions if you're writing a book. So if your book is about the training of leaders or how leaders, you want to keep it to that as far as possible. Keep the focus, keep it limited to that particular area. And then as you research, as you begin to write, there becomes the important aspect of research and the fact-checking process. And that is probably the most difficult, but it's also the most important aspect of writing. Because the last thing you want to do is to do a piece of work, spend the years or the months or the weeks researching or writing, and at the end of the day, your work is discredited because it is not factually correct. People who read the book disagree, and they can easily prove that what is in the book is not correct. Your work will be discredited, and it does you no good. So you want to ensure that the research is bang on, and that the process that you go through is extremely meticulous in doing that. So let's talk about the research and how you identify your sources. A key source is academic publications. So, for example, when I began to write, I had an issue because there were not many books written on Enigma. There were actually two books that I found. One from the Alexander Church that talked about the fighting Maroons of Dominica, and then another one by Miss Elizabeth that talked about just a particular period of the slave revolts, but it was just about a 2-year period. It was very specific, so there was not a lot in terms of academic publications that were floating around. But depending on what you want to write, if you're doing an essay, for example, when I do economic essays, there's a lot of material, academic material out there. Individuals who have looked probably at the same issue before, and probably now I want to put a different perspective to it. I want to create a different interest in that particular topic, but you have to make use of those. And then there is a route of expert interviews where you pay attention to individuals who may have information on this. A lot of the history, for example, something that is written from stories that are handed down. But in some cases, you can find an individual who has really taken an interest in that particular subject and who may have done some research on his own, may never have written anything, but has this information, and he can be considered to be an expert in that particular area. You want to make sure you're able to make use of this individual in helping you craft whatever it is that you are writing. And then the question of reputable websites. Thankfully now, that will probably play a lot bigger role, especially now with the advent of AI, Copilot, and Chat GPT, and so on. You find that there is a lot of information that you can get very readily from the internet. But there is also something to look out for, because while the information may be readily available, it does not necessarily mean that it is readily credible. It does not automatically mean that the information is credible. So that is something that you need to be aware of, and that's where the whole question of fact checking. But these are typically the sources that you'd want to go through. In my case, for example, when I did the Maroons of Dominica, a critical source that was there that had to be captured was in the United Kingdom National Archives, where they have all of the documents relating to that period of Dominican history, because the governors who ruled Dominica under the colonial era were supposed to turn in reports ever so often, and all of those reports are preserved, and they have meticulous detail. It was that period in British history, of course, where writing was critical and important. So you have this huge amount of material that is available that you can go through, and you can look at different governors, how they ruled the country, their reports on different stories and so on. And importantly for me as well, the internet played a major role, because I was able to get a newspaper site which actually archived newspapers going back to the 1700s. So there is a site called newspapers.com online. It's a subscription site, but it's relatively inexpensive. It's roughly, I think, about $80 for a year or something, and you can cancel. But it's an excellent source, because all of the physical newspapers they've been able to archive those papers and give you a way to easily search them, so you can search it. All right, although it is in PDF format, because they have literally scanned those and uploaded them, hundreds, literally thousands and thousands of newspapers during that period, from the United Kingdom, from Scotland, from Ireland, from the United States. So all of that is available. All of that material is there. That material is available online, searchable. And that was a game changer for me in writing this book, because a lot of the information could be verified. I could fact check a lot of the information that I had gotten from different sources, either from what Leonard Sanchez had written or from the National Archives. But now you had, as the events were happening, they were being reported on. And it is very important to note, because the period of the Maroons in Dominica was a very difficult time for the British, because that is the period when a lot of focus and attention was placed on slavery. It was placed upon the conditions of the slaves. And when they began to revolt, as they were doing in Dominica, it became a matter of tremendous interest to the British public. So you had newspapers reporting on it, and you also had, on the other side of the Atlantic, which is in the United States, Philadelphia, North Carolina, you had major areas where already you had resistance to British rule that had a keen interest in those stories. So, as an example, when I wrote about Bala, and the way he captured the Rosalie estate, I was able to get over 250 different articles that was written just on this individual in the newspaper archives, because people were paying attention. It was a major blow to the British hold over the colonies, and it was the beginning of the unraveling of the slave trade in the British West Indies. So all of that information is there. So knowing where to access your information is critical, and you have to ensure that those sources are credible. They're credible because you're talking about credible newspapers. The Times of London, the Scottish Inquirer, the Philadelphia Inquirer, you name it. These are credible newspapers that are out there. I was able to get this information from and be able to put it into this book in a form that was well understood. All right, so having talked about the credible information, now the other process, the other thing you want to do now, you have all of that information now, is how you gather and you organize that data that you have. So I was pulling out article after article. I would go online, I would do a search for Bala and Dominica, pull up all of those articles. I would pull up a search probably on slave ships and Dominica, and put the year, that period. Several articles would come up, and it has different years and so on. And then you have to begin to gather, and you have to begin to organize in a very systematic way the information that you have. Always checking for and ensuring accuracy and completeness of the data that is being provided. That is also important. So, for example, in some newspapers, I would get a partial account of what happened on a particular estate, but on another newspaper, I would get some more detail that would allow me to be able to fill in the missing pieces in that first article. So that was why it's very important to cross-check, and then at the same time, having access as well to the information from the National Archives that could also fill in some spots. So when, for example, I got a newspaper article dealing with a particular governor, let's say John Ord, or Inslee, one of the governors in Dominica, then I would be able to go back and check their own records, the records of those governors, when they were in the seat as governor and as they reported back to the colonial office in England. So that made it very important. And so that systematic arranging is very important. And as you go through, of course, you're taking notes, because you're trying to think of how best to arrange your chapters, how best to to organize it and so on. And that becomes very important. So the process of gathering and organizing of the data is very critical. As we said, ensuring the accuracy through fact-checking as many sources as possible as you have access to, cross-check, double-check, triple-check, ensure that whatever it is that you're putting out there is factual. That's the bottom line. That is very important. And also checking for key details. So, for example, I talked about the Rosalie estate and the taking down the Rosalie estate. And then you have one of the, again, making reference to that particular work having to do with one of the major Negma or Facel. Some persons consider him to be a hero. Others consider him to be what we refer to as a sellout, in the sense that when he was supposed to have come forward and joined with a famous French mulat to help free the slaves on the southeast coast of Dominica, he was a no-show. And many felt that he had sold out to the authorities. Checking that point was critical, because this is an individual that is seen as a hero in Dominica. And yet, in doing the research, it appeared as if he was not really all that of a great hero. While it started well, he was affiliated with some of the greatest Maroon leaders of his day, Jacko, Bala, Mabuya, and others. But there was some question as to his loyalty, and whether at some point, in exchange for his own safety, he decided to give information to the authorities. And some people even accused him, when the authorities were able to squash the revolt on the southeast of the island, whether it was not he that gave that information to the authorities. So that aspect of it, and being very careful to pin that historic figure, was very important to get that information and to fact. So I spent a lot of time fact-checking that information, verifying different sources, looking, digging, searching for information around this particular individual. So that's the kind of rigor that's important. And also the dates become vitally important. So, for example, on one instance, I got a note that a particular reverend, I think Reverend Peter, who was a deacon at the Methodist Church, had given information he had actually taken accounts of the suffering of the Maroons of Dominica. He had taken consideration of, and he had written that down in graphic detail. So he had put information down on the kind of suffering, the kind of punishment that were meted out to the slaves. And he gave that information to William Wilberforce, which formed the basis by which William Wilberforce was able to go to the British Parliament to talk about the conditions of slavery in the West Indies based on information he received. So I had to ensure that that was in fact credible by looking at the dates when this individual was in fact a deacon in Dominica, and when Wilberforce started his campaign in the British House of Commons. So that's the kind of record, that's the kind of confirmation that is required, double checking of the dates and so on that you need, so that at the end, when you're through, that whatever it is that you produce is beyond reproach, and no one can actually question his veracity and so on. All right, so that is key, ensuring the accuracy. All right, let's now moving on, because we have a few more slides to go through. So I hope that's okay in terms of the speed, and everybody is with me on that so far. Then we talk about structuring and organizing non-fiction content. Again, in paying attention to detail and organization is key to getting a good product. And one of the things you can do is to create outlines and frameworks, develop detailed outlines. And in other words, you want to, in your mind, as you frame your work, you want to decide how you're going to narrate, how you're going to bring that story out to your reader. Because what you want is you want your readers engrossed. You want from the time they begin to read that they want to keep on reading until the end. So how do you develop that? How do you organize that? One of the things that you do is to try to look at the main points, some of the main, develop it about thematic areas. Because I was doing a piece, a historical work, it was kind of relatively easy to do that in that regard, because it's historical. I could just start from the beginning and just come down the line. So I could do it by periods. Um, and then you had some major periods where you had, for example, the first Maroon War, the second Maroon War, and you have those periods already preset for you. So it's very easy to organize around those themes. It may be more challenging if you're doing a non-historic piece of work. If you're doing an essay, say on the health benefits of soursop, right? If you write an essay on the health benefits of soursop, then the way you organize that may be different, in terms of how you go about developing the main points, and getting the evidence to support that. So if you're doing something, say, on the health benefits of soursop, then you want to look at, is there any data, any scientific information that confirms that soursop fights cancer? How credible is that information? Is that something that the science community agrees on, or is it disagreement among? So these are some of the issues you want to consider, all right, in terms of getting the supporting information for that. And once you have that, then the logical flow is important. Again, how you do it. In my case, I was looking at a period from 1716 to 1818, from 1763, which is basically when Dominica really started as to have slaves come in, 1763 to 1817. So the logical flow was there, and being able to move from one period to the next was also important. If you're writing nonfiction, but then the coherence, how do you move from chapter to chapter? There must be a flow. What you don't want when you're writing, you don't want to go. For example, if you're looking at the movies, you see sometimes in movies, as you watch the movie, they may be talking about a current part, a current scene in the movie, and then the next scene is a throwback to some time before, and then you have to make the link between what happened before that scene and the scene that you're now looking at. It's kind of easier to do because it's visual and you can put two and two together. When you're writing, it is a more difficult thing to do. And so having this link is extremely important. That coherence must be there. That follow through must be maintained at all times. Okay, so moving along, then you come to a logical organization of this is the chapters. All right. So, for example, you're looking at one of the ways to organize your chapters is by themes. So, if we come back to our essay on soursop and the health benefits of soursop, then you can develop a theme. You can talk about the history of that. You can also, another theme could be around folklore around this, or just local beliefs around this. Then there could be something about the scientific aspect of it, and then probably another aspect of whether or not it works, whether there is evidence, or whether you found sources from different individuals that relate those particular issues. Okay, so all of that is important, and that can help as you structure your particular essay. And then there is a chronological organization. Again, how the flow is arranged in the book, and then you have effective chapter and section divisions are also important. All right. just having these is very, very important. All right, and then we move as we move along. Of course, if there are any questions, any suggestions, any feedback, you can feel free to interact at any point. Now, here's where it gets very interesting, and that is balancing the narrative flow with factual content. When I began doing my research and I began letting people know that I was researching this particular topic, for me, I had a lot of trepidation because, number one, I am not a historian, and I was going into a clearly historical theme. Okay, and people might say, well, it's best to leave history for the historians. But as I explained from the beginning, I thought there was an important story to be told, but it had not been told over all the years, and I felt almost an obligation to be able to write that story. Okay, but then I remember somebody remarking and saying, well, history is not a story. It's not a story that you're telling. But that's not quite right. It is a story. Whatever non-fiction work you are doing, it is a story. You're conveying a message or messages to your audience, and the style that you use is very important. And so I had some back and forth in terms of what is the best way to do it. What is the best way to actually be able to give out the information, to provide the information, and again making sure that the content was reliable, factual, and information verifiable. And the way I verified information, as I said, was by having the sources, and then you absolutely have to quote those sources, as we'll see later on when we talk about plagiarism and copyright and so on. You have to ensure that whatever it is that you're conveying is consistent with the storytelling. Okay, so you also allowed some room as well. So, for example, I'll give you a good example of this. In researching the information, I got an account by a certain military guy, a captain, who described the story of the death of Jacko. Jacko was probably the longest living Nekmawa leader. Over 40 years, he spent living free in the forest of Dominica, evading capture, while he saw the majority of his fellow Maroon leaders being killed. He was able to survive. Eventually, he was caught, and then there was a report by the captain about the moment in which he was captured. Okay, but then in recounting that story, I was able to take a little leeway and describe some of the build up to it, because although it is not described in his story, the build up, but it was very easy based on the way he related the story to imagine that particular build up to that event, so that the reader will understand as they go through the book, they will see the difference between what has been said as directly happened, and some of the information that is there, which is in my own writing. But I did that to a very limited extent because, as I said, there was just a tremendous amount of written information that I could reproduce and note that particular source. So it became relatively easy. You may have a bigger challenge if you're doing something that you don't have the same access to all of those sources and to all of that information. And so you have to find a way to engage, not only engage your audience, but to ensure that you again, the information is accurate. But importantly, that seamless thing that we talk about, as you go from chapter to chapter, you want the reader to keep turning those pages to be looking forward to the next chapter. So you must have this seamless move from one scene or from one chapter to the next, and as much as possible avoid going back, having covered something, coming back to it later on. It's better to just keep it moving, like a nice, easy flowing river. Just keep it moving along. That's a lot more. It's a lot less confusing to the reader, a lot more enjoyable. It makes a lot more enjoyable reading, and also enhances your own writing style. All right, now just before we go into the writing style and clarity and the tone that we are talking about, I will like you to know as well that Write-Tukubuli is also giving away several prizes during this period, and we are going to be giving a small quiz to you, and the first person who is able to put the correct answer in this comment box will receive a very special prize, and I will tell you what this price is as I pull up that information for you. All right, so we are talking about you have an opportunity to win 2 free books. All right, one book is called Dominic Anu, and that book was written by Simon Matthew and Sam George. So if you answer this first question correctly, that's a book that is going to come to you, one by Simon Matthew and Sam George. And the second question that I'm going to ask, you will get, if you are the first person to answer correctly, will get a free copy of my own book, The Maroons of Dominica. Okay, you had a question? Okay.
Sorry, so carry on.
Yes, okay, sure. So let's ask the question. In March of 1786, this brave Maroon chief died fighting to free his fellow enslaved brothers and sisters. The question is, what was his name? Okay, so if you can just tell me the name of this famous Maroon chief who died in March of 1786, over 250 years ago. Give his name, then you will get this book, Dominic Anu by Simon Matthew and Sam George. And then for the second question, in which you'll get a copy of the Maroons of Dominica, the question is, he was considered to be the most brutal governor to serve in Dominica, having issued a decree to kill all the Negmamo, their wives and their children. That was a proclamation that even the British press had to absorb because of the brutality of this particular governor. The question is, what is the name of this governor who ruled Dominica between the year 1813 and 1814? So if you can give the name of this governor, then you will get a book, The Maroons of Dominica. All right. So let's continue. Let's move along with the writing style as we talk about writing the facts, some of the things to look for, and one of it is the style and what we call the tone. What tone you're going to use. So you might, for example, sometimes when you read a book, the person that's writing the story, they put themselves in there, and it's like they're the ones telling you this story. That is one style. It's almost as if they're the ones, so you're being fed a story through the eye of the author. Okay, that is one style. That suits certain styles of writing. It does not suit every type. So for example, if I'm doing a historical piece, it does not help that I appear to be the one telling the story per se. I want that story to be told by the people who lived in that period. The story to be told by the governors, the story to be told by the administrators, by the colonial office. These are the characters that I want to be telling the story. because it becomes authentic, it becomes believable in this sense. But there are different styles, different essays that you may be writing when you want to do it on a kind of a personal kind of basis and almost do it as if you're the one doing the storytelling. And that is where you have to take into consideration those three things. The idea of matching tone to the genre, whatever it is, whatever style it is that you're applying. You want to choose a tone that fits the genre to effectively engage the target audience, okay? And again, it must have a certain character to that tone, in the sense that it has to draw the person in, you know. So for example, when I started the book, I talked about, I created the scene of slaves being torn out of Africa for the very first time and what it was like, you know, some of the trying to capture the pain and the agony and the suffering right from the get-go. So right away you get a kind of affinity with the characters in this book, because that's where they're coming from, and now they're forced into a country, and how do they react to that brutal system of slavery? How do they position themselves, given the experience, right? So that process, that tone that is used, becomes very, very important. And then the language, you know, again, you must consider your audience. If you're writing to, you know, college students, you want to have a particular language. If you're doing a children's book, for example, non-fiction children's book, it has to be in the most basic of language that a child will understand. Make sure you don't have any words in there that is too big or might confuse. You know, it has that level of clarity you have to ensure. And of course, it has to be built on the needs and the expectations. And also, as you're doing the work, you don't want it to be sometimes, for example, when I'm doing as I was doing that history book, I'm thinking that I'm going to have an audience across the line. You're going to have, you know, intellectuals, you're going to have professors, you're going to have very educated persons reading this book, but you're also going to have just the average person, probably not with a very high level of education, but who is interested in history and wants to learn more about that period of Dominican history. So they have to be able to take the book and be able to read it. So being able to go between those two was very important. All right. So the ability to break things down, the ability to put it in as simple as language as possible. And that takes us to the third type, you know, the kind of types you have very formal, you have very formal writing in some. So if I'm doing, for example, when I'm doing an essay in economics, it's very formal. There are certain terms that you must use and so on. That is formal. But if you're doing something that is probably different on nutrition or on exercise or something like that, then that will take a different tone. If you're doing an autobiography as well, that will take a different tone. If you're writing, for example, and if you're a very controversial person and you're writing your own story, you might want to do it in a way that will persuade person that you're not really that individual, right? So the language that you use, you know, the ability to persuade and so on. So using the different tone types is very important, whether it is formal, conventional, or persuasive. All of these must be considered. All right, then how do we communicate our ideas very clearly and concisely? Number one, you must use very clear language. Okay. Communicate, and even short sentences as well. Okay. It's very important to communicate, to use clear language, simple language, as simple as it can get. The simpler the better, because the simpler the language is in your book, is the easier for it to be read by everyone. Right, as simple as you can do it. Avoid complex languages. Keep your language. The shorter the language is, the better. The shorter the sentences are, is the better for your book. All right. You want to ensure that you're doing this. And then also, as you write, you want to avoid jargon. You want to. So, for example, I'll give you a good example of this. I was writing a book about the Maroons of Dominica, the Negmao. Now, the term that all of Dominica knows is Negmao. But I paid special attention not to mention the word at the beginning. I explained it so that somebody who may have heard the term will understand me talking about the same group. But I was speaking of an audience beyond Dominica, because that's a history about the country. There are individuals who are not in Dominica who may be interested in the book. There may be a current generation of British persons who want to know about their colonial past, who may want to read this book. So I'm avoiding terms that just us in Dominica would understand. I'm using more language that everybody, both in Dominica and outside, can understand. And that's very important. You don't want to have too many technical terms that people don't understand, they're confused about. You don't want to be using jargon that's not clear to everybody. So I know, for example, if you're writing about Dominica, something in Dominica, we have certain terms that is known only to us. If you're going to use it, if you're forced to use those terms, make sure that they're explained in a way that people can understand, right? Because at the end of the day, writing is about communication. Writing is about telling a story. It's about delivering a message on a theme, on something that interests you, something about which you may be passionate about to a public. But you want people now, the public, to be able to read and to be able to understand and to really value whatever it is that you're writing about. Okay? And then we want to engage through storytelling techniques. If you were with us earlier, you would have heard me talk about that story about the moose that lays the golden egg. I think that's a classical example of using anecdotes, to tell that story, because it's about a historical thing. It's about a myth that is that people grew up, talking about. But when you superimpose that with the geography of the country, the sentiments of the people of the village, what the children are doing, what the elderly people are doing, what the farmers are doing, it helps to bring some clarity. It helps to bring as much clarity as possible to that particular message, and that becomes very, very, very important. All right, so wherever possible, use anecdotes, incorporate personal or relatable stories to what it is that you're telling, that people can know. So if you're writing a story about going back to the health effects of the soursop, you want to, especially if it's personal, relate those stories. So if you had a personal experience and it benefited you were able to benefit from it, people can relate to that because you're talking from first-hand experience. Or if you have first-hand information where somebody told your story and you've been able to verify that story, it has been verified either through a doctor or otherwise, you can relate that because it makes your whatever it is that you're saying a lot more relatable, a lot more believable, and that's what you want. And by the same token, being able to provide examples, and whenever you're doing that, you want to use clear, concrete examples to clarify whatever complex information is been given, and where you can use vivid descriptions. Okay, so for example, again going back to that piece that I wrote. When I talked about Dominica, see how I talked about Dominica? I talked about it in a very vivid fashion. So I'm going back to this. I say, gentle sea breezes kiss the verdant coastline, and the towering mountains stand as they always have, as though jealously guarding this beautiful country. So I have turned just the idea of a mountain into something that is standing guard over Dominica, right? So that puts an image in your mind as to this, so you can imagine the majesty of the mountains. You can imagine them just there, guarded, standing watch over Dominica, right? That's what we're talking about. You evoke things into your writing that will make the reader, visually imagine what it is that you're trying to bring forward. All right. So all of that becomes critically important. The use of vivid descriptions. All right. As we come to the end, we must take a close look at ethical considerations, because if you're going to be writing a nonfiction, it has to be about telling the facts, and above else, it has to be truthful. So as important as the whatever it is that you're writing is the context, the ethical and legal considerations. So let's discuss that. Number one, that is something that from school days we learned, the need to avoid plagiarism. Now that is becoming increasingly more difficult, because with the use of AI tools as this, you can go on AI right now and ask AI to give you information about a particular activity, and it spits it up for you. You may get, and then you don't have a source. Now that AI software thing may have pulled it from a book or from somewhere, but it does not come with that quotation. All right. Now, if you take this and you put that wholeheartedly, without any kind of edits, into your book and pass it off as yours, then you could have problems, because that could very well be a quote from a well-known book about a similar subject. And here it is, you have it word for word in your book, and no source is cited. That is plagiarism. Plagiarism is the use of other people's intellectual property, the use of other people's work, without giving them the credit for it. Okay? So every time it's okay. If you're going to use a quote from a book, that is allowed. You must make note of and especially if you're doing a non-fiction work, you're able to put in end notes, you're able to put in footnotes. I personally prefer, especially if you're doing a book, I prefer the end notes instead of the footnotes. Footnotes is where you put the information on every page. Depending on what you're writing, that can get very disruptive, because you may have like 4 or 5 footnotes on one page, because you're taking material and you're putting them down verbatim, and you want to indicate what that source is. It is best to use endnotes, because it allows the flow, and the person can later on come back and refer to it. But by all means, make sure that your sources are very well quoted. You have to give the respect for persons who have probably thought this thing through, toiled over it, and that intellectual property belongs to them. And of course, the whole question of academic honesty as well, that becomes very, very important. So my book is loaded with quotes from newspapers, from the accounts of the governors, from the accounts of the Colonial Office, from the British Archives. It's just loaded, because I want you to be sure that the people understand that's not coming from me, but it's coming from that particular source, and you have to do this. And as we said, you don't want to just copy text wholesome from someone else's book and throw it into yours as if it is your work. That is not good. What some people do sometimes, they may take an idea from someone else's book and put it in their own words. Okay, so an example of that could be somebody's writing about the way they survive cancer, and they're relating what they have to go through, and they might say something like, I would lay there on the bed at night and feel the pain, and they go through a particular process of telling that story. Now you come to write and you say, but that sounds like me, I'm going to, and then you've read it, and then you see, well, that sounds like what I was going through, so I can just take it as it is in that person's book and put it as if it is mine. Okay, you really cannot do that. That's copying. All right, and so that becomes critical, and persons have to absolutely be mindful of that. And more, there are programs online that you can put the text in and see whether it's plagiarized, whether it is copyrighted as well. So that's always a good thing, as good practice. Even before you publish, you can run that through some of those programs to ensure that whatever you have within your book is not someone else's work that is going out there without the due credits. That is also very useful. And then the whole question of privacy and consent, that's important. I talked earlier about this professor who was writing this book and who called to get my permission because she wanted to be sure that she had permission from me to use my essay in her book for writers. Because it could be possible that at some point I could be reading that book and then here it is, my essays in, and I'm like, how did she get my essay? Why is my essay in there without my permission? Okay, so that's very important. If you're going to be using people's intellectual property, you must inform them. You must get their consent. If you conduct interviews with individuals and you want to publish what they tell you, you have to get their consent for publishing those interviews. Okay, you must get their consent before you publish what they reveal to you. Okay, that's important, and that's also good. Is good practice because you're respecting, people's privacy. You're respecting their safeguard, and you're showing that whatever it is that goes out there is not unauthorized. And the whole issue of being sued or legal action being taken against you and so on, all of that is minimized if you follow that particular course. And then the whole question of understanding copyright and fair use. Okay, some copyrighted text can be used within limits. You don't just write, and that's the reason why every book you see is copyrighted. It does not mean you cannot take quotes from that book, but again, if you're going to take those quotes, you have to indicate its source. All right, that takes care of that particular problem. All right, because at the end of the day, copyright is what protects the original works of individuals and restricts any unauthorized use to safeguard the creator's rights. Right? So that becomes very important. Then there's a fair use principle, which is well known in academic circles, that you can use limited use of copyrighted material is very important. You can do that, but it has to be within limits. It has to be reasonable. In other words, don't reproduce the whole works of someone else and claim it to be yours. All right, and you quote them, you just keep quoting them, quoting, because no, you had some of your own creativity to shine through, and you want to ensure that you don't infringe upon this. And of course, if you do that, you will be able to avoid any legal issues, because there are persons who have taken people to court over revelations in books. Okay, so sometimes somebody writes a book and they claim it's a revelation that they're coming up with some information, and then somebody says, well, that's not quite correct, and then they're sued for that. That happens all the time. But if you take care of those safeguards, you can necessarily avoid these particular issues that we speak about. Okay, so in conclusion, we have a very nice conclusion for you there on writing, just writing the facts, that production of Write-Tukubuli, as we try to encourage literary excellence in Dominica and get more writers. More and more Dominican writers are coming forward, but we still need a lot more Dominican writers to come forward and to write the history, write about the life of the country, put the information on paper, let it survive you and be read, years and years from now. All right, so just in conclusion, you need to know your genre and your audience. So as you think of what you're trying to write, you need to consider that, what does your audience want? Okay, who are you targeting when you're doing your nonfiction? Critical to any work of nonfiction is the research. That may take a long time. It took me more than 4 years to research the ruins of Dominica, but not constantly, but that's how long it took. Because of the rigor I wanted, because of the accuracy, because of what I wanted to share with the public. It took some time to go through and to write, okay? But the research, you cannot compromise on that. That's a critical part of it. And then once you have your information, then you begin to take your own notes. You begin to organize in your mind how you want it, or you want to structure. What you want ultimately is a nice flow to your work, so that as people move from one chapter to the next, they have been led along nicely with little thought of turning back, because they understand what you're writing. And finally, or very, very importantly, you want to respect the ethical and legal standards, which has to do with plagiarism and copyright material. At the end of the day, the safest thing to do is, one, ensure that whenever you use someone else's material, you indicate that's from this individual. And the second part to that, as you write, you want to ensure that if you're going to take any copyrighted material, or if you're going to reproduce information you receive from an individual, you want to get their consent, or if you want to reproduce something from someone, that you have to get consent to do so. If you follow those rules, then you'll find you'll have an interesting piece of work that people want to read, because it's filled with information. It's told in a nice, steady storytelling style that is understandable, clear language, short sentences, easy to understand, easy to follow. At the end of the day, you would have done yourself a great service. Okay. All right, so that's the end. We've come to the end, and I just want to thank you, and I just want to continue to wish Write-Tukubuli the best during this period of the Literary Festival, and wish everyone success as you move along. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.